Welcome, comrades and old and new faces, to this evening's branch meeting in Internationale Socialister here in Copenhagen. I'll just do this quick introduction in English to make it more smooth with the transition. But we are very lucky today to have a visit by Donny Gluckstein from our sister organization, Socialist Workers' Party in Britain, who has written this book, The Radical Jewish Tradition. And he'll say a lot more about that, of course. That is the topic of today's meeting and today's talk and discussion. But I just wanted to say that I think that we've all here in Denmark and in the rest of Europe really we all recognize this same kind of Zionist propaganda effort from our media and from our politicians, and this narrative that is constantly being sprung on us and constantly trying to reinforce it by, trying new scare tactics and tactics to split us up in the different groups that actually form the Palestine movement. And at the center of this is this idea that it's a struggle between Jews and Palestinians, and not a neo-colonial struggle going on by the state of Israel and all that. And we know all this, and it's not because I'm going to talk a long time. I just think that the overall thing that I'm really looking forward to in your speech is this, how can we as revolutionaries and as socialists counterwork that narrative, and not just by saying actually the anti-Semitic thing is saying that Israel is a beacon of light for all Jews, but just actually countering it with a counter history, really, which is But just with those words, I want to give the floor to you, Donny.
Thank you very much.
And I think we'll talk for about half an hour or so.
Okay.
Maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know.
That's what you said.
Around that.
I'll try that.
Yeah. Take it away, and then we'll.
Thanks.
Yes.
Okay. First of all, it's a book launched by me, but not just me. Jamie Stone, who's the co-author, but she's in Australia, so that's quite a long way to come. So you just got me tonight. Okay, so I'll talk about this book, and you introduced one of the things, but actually, this book was started before October the 7th, obviously, and that sort of thing, and it addresses three issues. One of which is to do with Palestine, but there's other ones as well, and in a way, it looks from the outside a bit obscure. The radical Jewish tradition. What does that matter? Even before October the 7th, people said, well, why make a fuss about that? I think there are three reasons why it's very, very relevant now. The first one has been mentioned. I'll come on to that. But the second one is the rise of the far right. Now, the far right, the fascists, neo-Nazis, etc., don't necessarily talk about anti-Semitism and Jews as much as they used to. Clearly they don't. But at the core of their ideology, the way that they make sense of the world, they need to explain it somehow, and they don't do it through understanding capitalism or anything like that. They have to have a conspiracy theory, and Jews are still very much central in terms of their thinking. I don't know if you have come across the thing called the Great Replacement theory. If you know that, then you'll know that it's George Soros, the financier at the top, who's bringing in the Muslims to try and dilute the popular and all that sort of stuff. So anti-Semitism is still an issue. It's still an issue, and you can see it in the rise of the far right all around the world. Well, certainly in Europe. The second one mentioned, of course, which is Israel. The Israeli state claims that it's entitled to bomb Lebanon, to carry genocide out against the Palestinians, etc., because it represents all Jews, and Jews were victims of the Holocaust, etc. And I just want to read a line from the Declaration of the Independence of Israel in 1948. and this is a direct quote from the Constitution, from the Declaration. After being forcibly exiled from their land, the people, the Jewish people, kept faith with it throughout their dispersion. We're talking about 2,000 years here. Throughout their dispersion, and never ceased to pray and hope for their return to it. Jews strove in every successive generation to re-establish themselves on their ancient homeland. In other words, for 2,000 years, all Jews have all been Zionists. That's the argument that's put. So that's the second reason why we wrote the book. And the third reason why we wrote the book is that the left is now accused of anti-Semitism. You know, everybody knows Hitler. No, these days the problem is with the left. The left are the cause, the source of anti-Semitism. Okay, and the book basically says, you won't be surprised to hear this, all three things are completely wrong, completely false, and we try to go through and expose each of those. First of all, it is not the case that Jews are trying to manipulate everybody else in some conspiracy, but quite the opposite. When you look at the history, what you see is that Jews joined with other people in common struggle for a common cause to liberate everyone. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that far from being supporters of Israel and Zionism for 2,000 years, actually Zionism, it's very, very clear, was established in 1897. Not before that, and actually the vast majority of Jews were not interested in Zionism at all, and the book shows that too, right up until the end of the Second World War. And the third thing that the book tries to show is that Jews were at the heart of the fight against anti-Semitism and fascism throughout. Jews and the left, Jews as part of the left, were at the core of fighting against fascism, racism, of any kind of oppression. And that's why the title of the book is The Radical Jewish Tradition, Revolutionaries, Resistance Fighters and Firebrands. And the argument is that there's not a separate radical Jewish tradition. Actually, one of the first sentences says, the Jewish tradition is the radical tradition and vice versa. So, it's Jews as part of a broader movement. And there's a final thing which I haven't addressed yet, which I want to, which is that one of the most amazing things in terms of this Jewish tradition is what happens when you put together oppression and exploitation, and you put the two together, and when you fight against them, it's really explosive. Because there's a view that the Marxist movement is economistic. You talk about exploitation, but you never mention oppression. Come in. Only just started. So there's one view which is that we're only interested in exploitation, we're not interested in oppression. And there's a counter view which says, all that counts is identity politics. You can fight against oppression without taking into account the issue of class and exploitation. And what the radical Jewish tradition shows is actually the two together are a very, very powerful force. Okay. I want to explain what the book says. I need to do a very, very brief history. And I want to start with the fact that oppression was real. Anti-Semitism was real. And you need to go back to the feudal period. Sorry to take you back 500 years. But in the feudal period, it was Middle Ages, was a landed society. There were basically lords, aristocrats at the top, there were the peasants at the bottom, and there was very, very little else. And in between, the development of trade, the development of commerce, the development of banking, and all of those sorts of things was not provided by the Christian population of Europe. One of the first people to do it were Jews who were brought in specially to carry out that role. And whenever anything went wrong, the Jews were the ones that you blamed. So, for example, when the Crusades began, when have we ever had wars to control the Middle East? The Crusades, going back 1,000 years. When the Crusades were taking place, they were finding it difficult to beat the Muslims in the Middle East, the Saracens, people like that. So the Jews in Europe were blamed. There was a Cold War against Jews in Europe. When the Black Death, and no doubt the Black Death swept through Denmark as it swept through everywhere else, when the Black Death was killing people, nobody could mention it. Explain it. How do you explain it? It must be the Jews. And so, I mean, just to give you one example, in Germany, and you know that there was a strong connection between Jews and Germany because the language Yiddish is basically a form, which was the language that the Jews spoke, was a form of German. During the Black Death, 79% of the places in Germany had pogroms, massive riots against the Jews. So, whenever anything went wrong, Jews are blamed. And as a result of that, particularly the Black Death period, there was a mass migration of Jews as refugees into Eastern Europe. So they carried Yiddish with them, but they end up in what was called later on the Pale of Settlement. Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania, Moldova, those sorts of areas. So you get a large concentration, about almost half of the world, half of the Jews in the world are living in this part of Eastern Europe because they were allowed to escape there. Because actually the king of Poland, a guy called Sigismund III, needed a layer of people to do the commerce, the trade, the banking, etc. So they were actually welcomed in to do that, but the anti-Semitism, of course, continued. Okay, so that's the situation in the Middle Ages. I want to move very, very quickly, move forward 400 or 500 years to mid-19th century Russia. Russia, by this stage, has taken over the area where the Jews are living. The Tsars called it the Pale of Settlement, and they called it the Pale of Settlement because Jews are only allowed to live in that area, because they're terribly anti-Semitic, the Tsars. They only want them to live in the Pale of Settlement, so they're concentrated there, can't move anywhere else. And another accident of history is that industrialization of Russia happens from the west, moving through to the east. It passes through the Pale of Settlement. So the first place to industrialize within Russia and develop a working class happened to be where the Jews were living, right? So you get a concentration of Jews. In the Pale of Settlement, they're only 12% of the population, so it's not that everybody in the Pale of Settlement is Jewish. They're a small minority, but they're a significant minority. In the rest of Russia, they're a tiny percentage. They industrialized, they're creating a working class, and you get a class division within the Jewish community. Because up until this point in the Jewish community, everybody is gathered together to defend themselves against the oppression. So class isn't an issue in the community. Everybody's just trying to stay alive and not be massacred, or killed or whatever in the next pogrom. But industrialization takes place in the mid-19th century, and you get a class division within the Jewish community between rich Jews who are able to, run businesses, etc., and a much bigger mass of poor working class Jews. Okay, so you've got the creation of a Jewish working class for the first time. And they're not alone in being part of the working class. I mentioned they're only 12% of the population there. So the rest of the working class, the Poles, Ukrainian workers, etc., there's a working class that working class Jews and non-Jewish working class people can unite. There's a class basis now for a Jewish radical tradition. Because up till this point, Jews haven't been radical. They've just been on the defence, and very religious. They've been clinging to the religion because that was the only thing they had to comfort them at times of pogroms, etc., etc. Okay, so you have the development of a radical revolutionary movement in Russia against Tsarism, against the backwardness, against the vicious rule of the feudal regime. And in 1881, they were anarchists. The anarchists managed to assassinate the Tsar Alexander II. And you have, at that point, a huge backlash by the government, by the feudal ruling class. And it was a wave of pogroms. And they had a slogan in the pogroms, and it was a simple slogan, a horrible slogan, but it was this: save the Tsar, beat the Jews. Right? Now, why did they have that? The only connection between Jews and the massacre of the Tsar was the fact that the people who killed the Tsar happened to stay in a guest house that was run by a Jewish woman the night before. Her name was Kezia Helfman. She was put on trial with the people that carried out the killing, but that was all you needed, because what you see about anti-Semitism is it's divide and rule. Save the Tsar, beat the Jews. And these days, the ruling class isn't as crude. These days they say, oh, there's too many immigrants coming on, But they were obvious, they were open in those days. We'll save the Tsar by turning everybody against the Jews. So that creates a massive movement of refugees. About 4 million Jews have to escape Eastern Europe. To escape Eastern Europe to stay alive, and they travel to the United States. They travel to all sorts of places. So this is the development. You've got a Jewish working class that is being radicalised because it's both exploited and oppressed, and they're spreading all over the world. So we've got a Jewish radical tradition established on a big scale. And I want to, before I go on to show you the scale of the Jewish radical tradition, I just want to mention the ideological side as well. I want to mention 3 people: Karl Marx, Rosa Luxemburg, and Leon Trotsky. All Jewish, okay? And the question is why? And before I go any further than that, I need to say we always talk about Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. So it's not just a Jewish tradition. We always talk about Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. So it's not just a German revolutionary tradition.
Because Engels was not Jewish.
He was not, no. So the ones that I'm mentioning,
Marx.
yeah. So Marx was, Engels wasn't. Rosa Luxemburg was
not.
Well, he wasn't religious, but in terms of anti-Semitism, his father, his grandfather.
Jew who was not a Jew.
Yeah, well, we can discuss what that's about in a minute. We'll come on to that. And the final one, Leon Trotsky. Nobody says Leon Trotsky. It's always Lenin and Trotsky. Lenin wasn't Jewish. Okay, so what we have here is an ideological radical tradition as well, and the question is, where does that come from? And I think part of it is the fact that Jews were an international grouping. They were spread all over the place, and if you look at the last lines of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels' Communist Manifesto, how does it finish? It finishes, "Workers of the world unite." They wrote that in 1848. 1848 was the year that you had a huge wave of revolutions, national revolutions, in Germany, in Italy, in Hungary, national revolutions. And at that very moment, Marx and Engels are writing, "Workers of the world unite." So the international tradition, I think, is very, very strongly rooted. And it's not just because you're Jewish, but that actually helped to get that perspective. And that perspective, because you're discriminated against, oppressed, and all the rest of it, you also have an outsider perspective on society. You're not bought into it because you're an outsider looking in, and therefore you could be more analytical. So I think there's an ideological element to the Jewish radical tradition, as well as a massive, radicalized working class Jews. You actually have intellectuals, if you like, that have a particular angle that they can bring to the radical tradition as a whole. Okay, so how significant was this Jewish radical tradition? I'm going to just throw statistics at you, and I hope that there are not too many of them. But I'll just give you some examples. Okay, so the first one. Jews were 4% of the total Russian population, 1 in 25. Within the revolutionary movement, and we're talking about pre-Marxists, the Narodniks, the populists, the anarchists, etc., twice the proportion that they had in the general population, and the same in the Marxist movement when it developed at the end of the 1890s. Few more statistics. 1/3 of the delegates to Bolshevik party conferences were Jewish, right? They're 4% of the population, 33% of delegates to conferences. In other words, they're radicalised and they're prepared to put their necks on the line because it's a dangerous thing being revolutionary. They're not just radical, but they're active and they're fighting back. That's the power of oppression and exploitation put together. Now, I think the most remarkable statistic in terms of Russia is Petrograd in 1917. Now, Petrograd was the capital of Russia. It was the heart of the 1917 Russian Revolution. It's outside the Pale of Settlement, so Jews aren't allowed to live there. At that time, in the factories, 0.3% of the workers in Petrograd were Jewish. 0.3%. the Soviet comes out of the revolution. It's the most democratic organisation you can imagine. Immediate recall, elected from the factory floor, etc., etc., etc. So the workers, 0.3% of the workers are Jewish. 11 out of the 35 on the Soviet executive were Jewish. Okay? And this is not about manipulation, because they took much higher risks. 1/3 of the people arrested as Narodniks were Jewish. 1/3 of the people arrested in the 1905 revolution were Jewish. So you have a radical movement taking the lead, taking the risks, as part of a bigger movement to liberate everyone. And now I want to spread it onto the international scale, just to show you it's not limited to Russia. The American Communist Party in the 1920s to 1930s. Okay? Jews were 3 million out of a population of 120 million, 1 in 40. Half of the American Communist Party in the 1920s and 30s was Jewish. Okay? This one I knew nothing about until I did the research. There's the International Brigade in the Spanish Civil War, fighting fascism, right? 1 in 4 of the International Brigades were Jewish, right? Now, one that's close to my heart, because my mother was South African. South Africa is an interesting example. So Jews, again, are 0.3% of the total population. That figure keeps, 0.3% comes up. So Jews are 0.3% of the South African population. They're 2.5% of the white population. Okay? Right. The first big trial of apartheid, it was called the Great Treason Trial. Of all the whites that were in the room, half of them were Jewish. And yet only 2.5% of the white population. Everybody knows about Nelson Mandela. When Nelson Mandela was put on trial and put away for how many years was it? 20, 30, 40 years? There were some whites put on trial with him. It was called the Rivonia trial. Every single white person put on trial was Jewish. Right? So that is, when you're talking about exploitation and oppression put together as a radicalizing force, you can see what it means. Not just in Russia, but on a world scale. So that's the radical Jewish tradition, if you like, in terms of its scale. Massive involvement. Okay. But I don't want to suggest that all Jews were radical Jews, etc., part of the Marxist movement, and so on and so forth. There were a lot of different currents, and there were 3 really that you can identify on the left. First of all, there was Marxism, and I've talked about, Marx himself, Rosa Luxemburg, Leon Trotsky, and so on. So there's the Marxist tradition. There was also another tradition which was called the Jewish Labour Bund, and this was a tradition it was socialist. It claimed to be revolutionary, but it said that Jews, because we're an oppressed group, we have to organise separately. So a revolutionary socialist, but we organise as a separate group, and that was called the Bund. And then the final group, and this might surprise you, but on the left were the Zionists. There were left Zionists from the very beginning of the Zionist movement. There was the right-wing Zionists that are running Israel now, etc., those horrible people. But there were people on the left who said, and this was the way they put it. They said, while we want a homeland away from all this horrible oppression, we'd like to have Palestine. But while we're not in Palestine, while we're here, we're socialists. So they called themselves socialist Zionists. And they were quite a significant group of people. The question is, how significant? How strong was Zionism in amongst Jews? And I just want to... it's difficult to work out, because in those days they didn't have opinion polls. These days you get opinion polls on everything, don't you? Percentage this, percentage that. They didn't have that. But there's one way of testing how popular Zionism was in the Jewish community, which was when 4 million people moved from Eastern Europe to anywhere else, because they had to escape because of the pogroms. Where did they go? Because if you're a Zionist, it's very clear. If you are moving, there's only one place you can go, it's Palestine. That's where you have to go. If you're a Zionist, that's automatic. You move from where you are in Eastern Europe and you go to Palestine. So what proportion went to Palestine? Right, well, I'll tell you. 1 in 27. 1 in 27. 26 out of 27 were not Zionist. Didn't agree with Zionism and so on and so forth. I mentioned 3 traditions. I mentioned the Marxists, the Bundists, and the Zionists, in terms of the working class Jews. The Marxists were clearly anti-Zionist. The Bund, which was a very big organisation, was strongly anti-Zionist. Well, the Bund had a phrase, and it had this word Doigkeit, and Doigkeit means here-ness. And what it meant was, you fight anti-Semitism where you are, here. You don't run away. So they were completely anti-Zionist. So the Marxists and the Bund were anti-Zionists. Obviously the Zionists were Zionists. But they were a very, very small proportion. 1 in 27, something like that. It's not an exact science, but you can tell from where people went that is the case. And I'd like to read to you from... how am I doing? Yeah. I'd like to read to you from a book by a guy called Walter Laqueur. And Walter Laqueur wrote a book called The History of Zionism. He's a Zionist himself. And he's describing the Zionist movement in 1933, the year that Hitler took power. So Hitler has not yet come into power, but he's talking about what is the state of the Zionist movement. He says the following. How little had the Zionist movement achieved in more than 3 decades, because it was only formed in 1897. So how little it had achieved. We've not won over the Jewish masses to the Zionist idea. Of the 3 million American Jews, only 88,000 voted in the Zionist elections recently. In Romania, 40,000 voted out of 500,000. In Hungary, only 5,000 out of a Jewish community of 489,000. German Jews, the majority are actively opposed. In Britain, the majority of the community are indifferent or actively hostile. So the idea that somehow, for 2,000 years, all Jews have been Zionists and waiting to... complete and utter rubbish. Complete and utter rubbish. The history simply doesn't explain that at all. And I want to move on now to what did radical Jews do? Because my argument is they're not doing something separate. They're part of the common movement. And I'll just go through a few examples. The first one is within what was Russia at the time. Strikes. Massive waves of strike in Poland where the Jews were concentrated, often, obviously, against Jewish employers. So this was a class movement. It wasn't, an identity politics movement. It was a class movement. In 1905, the 1905 revolution, 1/3 of all the strikes took place in Poland. The strike rate in the Pale of Settlement was 5 times the rate in Moscow. So you can tell the radical role of Jews within the Russian Revolution. And I mentioned, of course, the Petrograd Soviet in 1917 and those sorts of statistics. One of the things, there's 3 pictures on the cover of this book. The first one is from 1905 in Russia. This one here is from a strike, which I was very interested to discover more about today when I was in the Workers' Museum in Copenhagen. I'll tell you about it in a second. This is a strike of Jewish seamstresses.
Jewish what?
Jewish seamstresses, people who worked on cloth,
Okay.
About what's happening there. That's right. Yeah. Jewish seamstresses. Because part of the anti-Semitism of Jews were not allowed to do many jobs. And tailoring, making clothes and things was one of the things that they were allowed to do. So when they arrived in America, and this is from Lower East Side, New York. This is New York. So they'd arrive in New York, they'd get off the refugee ship, and they'd stay in New York, in Lower East Side of Manhattan. And there was a huge strike. 1908, 1909, a wave of strikes, and it was called the Great Uprising. It was a wave of strikes, as I say, by Jewish seamstresses, but it wasn't just Jews. There were where are the statistics here? There were 19,000 Jewish women, but there were 2,000 Italian women, etc., etc., etc. So it was a big mixture of people. And out of this strike, and I've forgotten this, in 1910, the Second International is meeting in Copenhagen, and they decided to call International Women's Day. and it was on the basis of this strike of predominantly Jewish women. Okay? Yeah. So, in interesting, I've forgotten that it was 1910 in Copenhagen. The decision was taken to make up International Women's Day. And the next picture, the final picture that I'll refer to, is this one here. And this is, it's hard to see because it's very small, but it's a woman here, Jewish woman, being arrested by two British bobbies. So this is in London, and this is in 1936. And just to explain 1936, Hitler has been in power for 4 years. Fascism is rising right across Europe, and the fascists in Britain are growing fast. And what the fascists decided to do was to march through the area where the Jews were living in London. They were concentrated in an area called Stepney. I actually grew up near there. East London. It was the same as Lower East Side, New York. You arrived off the boats, and that's where you were, and the same sweatshops and tough working conditions. So, the leader of the fascist party, the British Union of Fascists, decided we are going to march through this area. There are 60,000 Jewish people living in the East End of London, but 300,000 people turned up to stop the fascist marching, right? And that day it was called, the street they tried to get to was called Cable Street, and it's called the Battle of Cable Street. And at the Battle of Cable Street, British fascism was broken. After that, they were never really on the out. They were on their way down. They were on their way out. It wasn't just the Battle of Cable Street, because they could have come back. What was quite interesting about this was that the Communist Party, and the Communist Party was quite radical in those days, Stalinist, but still militant on the ground. What they said is that we don't just fight the fascists, we organise on a class basis to defeat the fascists. And what they did was there was a whole number of strikes, of people who were being evicted from their homes because they couldn't afford to pay the rents. And the Communist, some of them were fascists. The Communist Party went to them and said, we will support you in resisting being kicked out of your home, being evicted from your home. And so they won them over. The fascists realised that actually the people that stand with them on a class basis are not going to be the fascist leader, who was a lord actually, but ordinary people. Sir Oswald Mosley was the leader of the British fascists. So they broke fascism both in terms of physically stopping them and building a movement that was an alternative to the sort of despair that the fascists were spreading. Okay, so I hope I've described to you the Jewish radical tradition. I'm going to finish up.
Yeah, you get 5 minutes to sum up it.
Sure, yeah, that's fine. What I want to do now is I want to talk about what happened to the radical tradition. Because the radical tradition was effectively killed off. And I mean killed, literally. Killed off. And it was killed off by three things. Because, and today we're facing a very, very different tradition, a different situation. Just a depressing statistic, 55% of all the Jews in the world live in Israel. Right. Now think about what we were describing before, when the vast majority of Jews went somewhere else. So what has happened? What happened is three things. The first thing is Stalinism. Okay, so the Russian Revolution was the highest point of the Jewish radical tradition, and it was also the greatest breakthrough for the Jewish radical tradition, because up to that point in time, almost half of the Jews in the world lived in Russia, and when the Russian Revolution took place, the Jews got full equality with everybody else. Okay? So, emancipation. So, the biggest breakthrough was 1917, and that's why 50% of the American Communist Party was Jewish, and that's why all those statistics came out. But Stalin, he not only destroyed the Russian Revolution and established state capitalism, he also needed a scapegoat, just like the Tsar, remember? Save the Tsar, beat the Jews. Don't worry about Stalin killing millions of you. Don't worry about Stalin forcing you into the labour camps. Don't worry about Stalin doing the X, Y, and Z. Anti-Semitism was returned. Stalin used anti-Semitism. So people who were on the left, who looked to Russia and all that sort of thing, found it more difficult, if you accepted that Stalin still represented that tradition, to associate with it. So Stalinism, in a sense, ideologically, was a big problem. Okay. But an even bigger problem, of course, was Adolf Hitler. Because if you think about it, Adolf Hitler managed to exterminate 6 million Jews, right? And also, if I'm right about the proportion of ordinary Jewish people being radicals, a lot of those 6 million will have been radicals. So he physically destroyed a large number of the Jewish radical tradition. But equally bad was what all the other capitalist governments in the world did when he was carrying out this. Because when Hitler comes to power, the Jews, they're used to this, they've been doing it for centuries, tried to escape. Because you could see the anti-Semitism coming. You didn't have to be far-sighted to see that it was dangerous to live in Germany if you're Jewish. Whenever they tried to come out, it's the same as refugees now. We don't want you, right? And what's absolutely remarkable is the way that all of the capitalist countries, Denmark included, closed their doors to Jews who were trying to escape from Germany. And we're talking about all of them. The Ecuador, Brazil, Argentina, places you wouldn't think, all around the world. One of the last places that Jews were able to get to was Shanghai, right? You've probably heard about these boats of Jewish refugees that weren't allowed to land. So some ended up in Shanghai closes its doors to Jews. All around the world ruling class slammed its doors shut. Now, if the basis of your argument is that Jews and non-Jews have a common interest, we will liberate each other together, and all of a sudden every door is slammed in your face, then the idea of solidarity from non-Jewish people becomes more difficult to argue. So you've got Stalin, you've got Hitler who's been massacring people, and all of the other governments have been joining in terms of shutting doors to refugees, just like we see refugees being, having doors shut now. But at that time, it was predominantly Jewish people. So all of those things together were enough to really sort of, I don't know if you know the phrase, put the nail in the coffin of the Jewish radical tradition. And so at the end of this, by 1945, after the Holocaust and all the rest of it, Zionism, which really wasn't of interest to most Jews beforehand, has all of a sudden become, that's all we can look to. Okay? And that's a real tragedy. And then if that wasn't bad enough, Israel comes along. And Israel literally destroyed what was left of the radical Jewish tradition. I'll just give you one example. The vast majority of the world's Jews spoke Yiddish, right? German language. In 1910, David Ben-Gurion, who's going to be the first Prime Minister of Israel, says, you are not allowed to use Yiddish anymore, you have to speak Hebrew. Right? Now, at the time, the Hebrew, first of all, was an invented language. It was like Latin in the Roman Catholic Church. Nobody spoke it. It was in the books, but he didn't speak it. To make it speakable as a daily language, actually, there was a guy called Eliezer Ben Yehuda who invented all the words that were missing, from the ancient language. And he's the first person who spoke Hebrew and nothing else was his son, a guy called Itamar Ben Yehuda. And the only way he could do it he could make it happen, his father, was to not allow his son to hear anybody else speaking. He was brought up in total isolation. I felt sorry for the guy, for the little boy. So it was an artificial creation. 1 in 400 people spoke Hebrew at the time. The Zionists went out to destroy the Jewish radical tradition. So you have not just Hitler, Stalin, and all the rest of it, and the world capitalist. You also have within Palestine itself, it's not yet Israel, the Zionists are out to destroy any memory of that because they want to establish their Zionist dominance. So that, in a sense, is the sad end to this, except, I think, when we have the discussion, we'll see that there's a revival of the Jewish radical tradition. It never really went away. But anyway, so I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Donny. Now we'll have discussion, debate, comments, questions, and you'll get to what would you say? Collect all the threads at the end, and kind of maybe respond to some of the things. Also, if relevant, you might respond during the discussion if there is something direct. Usually here to the new people, we do it with we do this debate thing with a list of first-time speakers, a list of second-time speakers, and first-time speakers always come first. With that, the floor is open, but I thought maybe we should do a quick name round first, because it's just because it's good for me to know when I put people down on the list, so I don't call you with the black shirt or you.
Wrong color.
Okay, but so I'm Anna.
I'm Sarah.
Adam.
Carla.
Charlie. Julian.
Daniel.
Heidi.
Jeremy. Ole. Sorry.
Yeah.
Bo. Freddy.
Wetten.
Yes. You're welcome to make your contributions in Danish if you want. I'll try to translate as we go along, but you can also just make it in English. But it should be open for both. So the lists are open. Carla? Yeah.
So thank you very much for a very interesting talk. And I did want to sort of pull on the last thread you put out there with the revival of the radical Jewish tradition, because I think we've very much seen that. I don't know the facts of it, but I'm sure it was never buried. I know, for example, that the Jews for Peace, I don't know if what they're called but
Jewish Voice for Peace.
Have existed before the 7th of October, but have become more relevant and has had sort of a revival since then. And I was just wondering if you, Donny, or anyone else would like to sort of give some more information about how has the radical Jewish tradition sort of lived on a smaller scale through the years? What has been sort of the tendencies in that? Because it's very clear what's happening right now, but I don't know much about what has happened up until 7th of October in terms of that thread.
Jeremy? Yeah?
Shall I just ask my question now?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, sure. I've also read your book, by the way. I have a copy here. Well, my question is just, I want to hear if you think it is, when we look upon Israel today, since you're an anti-Zionist, do you think that the state of Israel should be dissolved? Because I hear some people think that it should be dissolved, considering the history of how it came to be, with taking the Palestinians' lands and all the genocide that is going on in the moment. And then I was just a little bit curious if you think that it should be dissolved, or whatever kind we should, whatever solution there should be. Because my impression is today, when I talk about this, I once chat about this on Facebook with a guy who clearly was a Zionist, and other people who were in favor of the existence for Israel. They think that, okay, because of the current anti-Semitism that is going on in our world right now, that's a proof that Israel needs to exist and so on. So I'm just a little bit curious about your opinion about this and how to look upon this and so on.
I just want to say thank you so much for such a brilliant speech. Really looking forward to reading your book on my own. As someone who has a grandparent of Jewish origin, I found it incredibly thrilling to hear about this, though mine were pretty much bourgeois coming from Germany, so that color doesn't relate to me as much. But anyway, my question has to do with, you talked about the radical Jewish tradition kind of like having a revival now. And of course you've had even after the state of Israel, a lot of radical Jewish intellectuals, I could think about like people like, say, Murray Bookchin, famous American anarchist, but also like in terms of going forward, because that's what I'm interested in how do you see the radical Jewish tradition getting reborn, or has it ever gone away really, or has it survived in small pockets and only now getting reignited? That's kind of like what I'm really, the historical continuity, that's the thing I'm kind of interested in. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a hand I missed. En hånd jeg ikke har set, men yeah.
I promise you I've never asked this question before, and I've heard him do this speech quite a lot, and he never does it the same way twice. But I was just thinking about that volatile combination of fighting oppression and fighting exploitation. And one of the main features of the protests of the genocide in Palestine, Gaza, has been the number of women Muslims have come to the fore and have led these demonstrations in city after city and country after country. And I just wondered how transferable that combination is, and how do we look to the future for black and brown people, trans people, women coming forward and fighting both their oppression and against their exploitation, leading the united fight back.
Ballet er stadig åbent, som vi siger på dansk. Charlie?
Thank you very much, Donny, for a very, very interesting and good talk. I was quite surprised actually to hear that actually there is a majority of Jews in the world actually living in Israel. That must have changed over the years, because when I was a younger person, they always said that the majority of Jews lived outside Israel. So there must have been a very big move for Jews to go to Israel to make that or maybe just also reproduction, obviously. But my question would be a little bit about, when you're talking about the revival of the Jewish radical tradition, does that mean that, and I'm not suggesting that the liberation of Palestine is going to come from within Israel, but would things like breaking the silence people and people who are working along with Palestinians in that wonderful picture, No Other Country, and so on, is there any move at all within the Israeli society itself to make solidarity, as you say, unite the human race, if you like, or is that just a pipe dream? But because I politically I know that the real force of change in the Middle East is going to come from the uprising in Syria and the working class of Egypt and so on. But it would give an insight as well to think about what possibilities are there for the actual destruction or the disintegration, if you like, of the Israeli civil society because of the things going on at the moment, and what that monster country is actually doing.
So since so many of the contributions so far have been questions for you, Donny, then maybe you'll take a few of them now, or yeah.
Okay, so the revival of the Jewish tradition, the radical Jewish tradition, how did it live on? Sorry, was that the first question?
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, that was Carla's question.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the radical Jewish tradition has been actively destroyed in a sense by Israel, has deliberately tried to do that. But not all Jews have been Zionists, and so we've always had an existence of people who are not, who are, sort of, if you like, ethnically Jewish, but don't identify with that. And in fact, if you look in the history of the left, there's a massive revolutionary tradition, and in a sense Zionism was an aberration from that. So in that sense, Zionism has tried to destroy the radical Jewish tradition. It can't, because it's there through a whole number of people and currents that have been around. The question about dissolving the state of Israel. Is that right? Was that the next question? Yeah, that's right.
Yes, George.
Yeah. Basically, I don't see Israel disappearing until capitalism disappears. It's too much a fundamental part of the imperialist architecture within the world that is not going to be allowed. So, in a sense, it's always been the case that the struggle of Jews and the struggle of working class Jews and the struggle of all working class people is linked together, and therefore you can only really get rid of it when you can only get rid of the Israeli state when we get rid of imperialism as a whole system across the world, and that's why we talk. Trotsky's idea of permanent revolution, that you don't stop in one country or one place, you actually keep the thing going all the way through. So that's important. So the third one is the question of exploitation and oppression. Is that right? Was that?
If I ask that, we don't have to have it in any order.
I forgot what the question was. Sorry.
You were saying, is it transferable to women, to gay people who are fighting their oppression as well as their exploitation? Will we see an explosion of leadership within the Marxist, leadership of people who also have the high stakes of fighting their oppression to come forward?
No, you've lost me.
It was about, like, for example, Muslim women leading the demonstrations in the Palestine movement across Europe, for example. And
I mean, clearly the connection between oppression and exploitation. You can be oppressed and not exploited. You can be exploited and not oppressed. But actually, the Jewish radical tradition is one in which there was massive exploitation and oppression and divide and rule. And so I think that they go together. You can't separate them.
Is it transferable to other groups of oppressed and exploited people, was my question.
Let me just think. Yes, it is. I mean, basically, the way that capitalism works is it tries to divide people on through oppression, and there's the class division as well. You will not overcome capitalism. You cannot overcome capitalism if you say, for example, I'm only going to fight on exploitation. I'm not going to bother with issues of oppression, because if you do, then the working class will always be divided and you'll never succeed. If you only fight over the ideas of oppression and you don't address the class issues, then the motor of history, which is the working class, will not be mobilised, and therefore, so we always have to connect the struggle against exploitation and the struggle against oppression, and unless you address both at the same time, you can't win in that sense. And the last thing, a big move of Jews to Israel, any solidarity from Israel, is it a pipe dream?
That was what I was asked.
Yes, that's right. And on that one, I think, yes, it's a pipe dream. And the reason is that there's a material interest in the Israeli working class working with the Israeli ruling class. You know, they've expelled, they've massacred, they've taken over a land that is not theirs. It's the world working class. We have no country, and therefore it's going to be difficult to see the Israeli population who have a material benefit from being a wing of imperialism rising up. I think who knows what, it's difficult to predict the future, but what you can say is that only when there is no alternative left will Israel sort of split and divide. It is a settled colonial state in the Middle East designed to serve the interests of American, Western imperialism. So I'm afraid that's the case. That's what my view anyway. Yeah.
Yes. I have put myself on the list as a first-time speaker, I guess. So yeah, but you can still raise your hand while I'm speaking, and I'll try to multitask. Yeah. So I just have where to start. Well, just one fun fact that I came across while researching for an article about. So here in, well, most people in this room, but not you, I think, will know that as like parallel to what has been happening in a lot of other European, especially Northern European countries, the Danish Parliament from right to left agreed on a so-called anti-Semitism agreement to bolster like the combating anti-Semitism, and they very neatly swerved around other kinds of racism. And when the most left-wing party in the parliament well, they supported it, and when they went out and spoke in the media and said how great it was, it's like, oh, finally we're one step further towards you shouldn't, fear for your safety when you walk on the street, whether you're gay or Jewish or have a different, they just neatly went around the fact that the most visible and visceral form of racism in Danish society today is anti-Muslim racism, even though anti-Semitism, which by the way is very connected to that as well, right, in many of its roots, is like you say still an issue, and it's just, we have that, and when you look into that agreement, it leans very heavily on an organization called the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance or something like that, which sounds, like it sounds like a sort of, never again sort of organization born out of, with of course the Holocaust and the horrors under Hitler and under the Second World War as like its point of departure. But when you look into everything it does, fun fact, its main spokesperson right now is also a British lord, by the way. I saw by the name of Eric Pickle, which is just quite wild. It's just when you look at its people, it's just very. It's supposed to be an overarching sort of anti-racist organization, but really it's mostly white people, and it's a lot of British people who are very high up, House of Lords type people in the top, which is just interesting that you have all all the parties from left to right leaning on this organization as the exemplary sort of organization to align yourself with in this regard, and it has been criticized a lot by Jewish Voice for Peace or Jøder for Retfærdig Fred here in Denmark, and all this. It's just because you were talking about how the main fascist leader in Britain was a lord, and lo and behold, the main lobbyists for the most clean-washed neoliberal way, like formulation of Zionism, are also somehow British lords. So it's all like it's just quite wild to see. And that was really just a fun fact with a whole bunch of things stuck onto it. But then there's just this other thing with like, can you compare like the things you said? Can you compare? Like, isn't it always a thing, really, that when you have these minority groups who are both exploited and oppressed and fighting their oppression, but also forming parts of the left and things in that regard, wouldn't, like, isn't it always a thing that there is a sort of, like, at least the possibility or the potential for the birth of a radical tradition there, and maybe it is, like, I think we've seen that a lot, like, it's just also just everything about, for example, civil rights in the US, or black feminism, for example, forming a very critical part of taking a lot of what feminism was in the 1960s further. And like there are so many examples everywhere. But also, like I was just wondering about, like there is a sort of specific thing about, also from what I hear in Donny's introduction, like a specific position that Jewish people have had through like a very, very long time, and we should of course be careful not to construct some kind of Jewish exceptionalism where it's like this creates a very unique fertile ground for this radical tradition, because you can build radical tradition like you should and could build radical tradition many places. But I think we see, I think like there is this crucial point, which is before Zionism coming in as something that looked like a viable option for people, it was not, it was like for obvious reasons not possible to center the radical activity around a national project in any way. And I think that is a big difference from what you see. Like I'm not here to judge a bunch of radical traditions within different minority groups that I'm not a part of, but just it makes sense that, you know, if the project is to carve yourself a space in the national community in a way, then it's easier to, like when some kind of admission is made, like some kind of progress is made, like it was like you saw in the 60s and 70s with a lot of like, even though a lot of struggles are definitely not over, then we saw a lot of progress in terms of the end of segregation in the US, for example. But that becomes an American history, and this other thing becomes a Danish history, and this other thing again becomes a British history, and you still see the Palestinian, the Palestine movement is still very much formulated around the idea of a state of Palestine in a way, and since it doesn't exist, that is like. Since it doesn't exist or is being oppressed in the way it is, then it's already more radically formulated than with existing places. But I don't know. I feel like I say this in a very messy way. I just feel like you do meet a lot of very like quite radical rhetoric around for example, the Palestine movement, and also like with regards to, for example, Syrian refugees and stuff, but usually because there are still like these like nationalisms around which can like be said to like envelop these radical movements, then you still end up with a sort of like, yeah, we need someone from top down to dissolve the state of Israel and create a state for the Palestinians, because that's the not very radical nationalist oriented language we can speak in. Like, does it make sense? Like, and that like it just sounds like from the introduction and from the point from the book that is something that is special, if not exceptional, about this radical Jewish tradition, that is for so long it has not been really bound up on a national project. Not that no one has wanted it, but yeah. That was very long, sorry. So Charlie, and then Jeremy, and then Carla. Yeah, and okay, then Charlie, and you go, and then yeah. Sarah.
Thank you, Donny, for your talk and what seems like a really timely book. I wanted to ask, and I'm from the UK as well, so I thought I'd speak a little bit about the situation that we saw over the summer with the kind of rise of riots at the far right, and the unity that we saw amongst the Israeli flag showing up, at Unite the Right demonstrations, and I kept thinking to myself, well, what is the end game here? Where do they see this kind of unity leading to? And I guess in your framing of the end of a radical Jewish tradition being around the closing of borders and the increase in fascism across Europe, how do they maneuver, I guess, that kind of thinking around fascism today, coming from that particular history, if that makes sense?
Then we have John.
Yeah, I'd just like to address what Jeremy was asking you, Donny. I think on the broad base, I quite agree with you that Israel will be dissolved when capitalism becomes dissolved. That's true. But I think at the same time, associates should say, and also say to the movement, that we agree that Israel is an apartheid state. It's run by a religion. It's a religious state, it's a theocracy. It's not a democratic state because there's a very significant minority in Israel that is not given basic rights, land or inheritance and so on. So I think Sushi's position on that is that yes, Israel should not exist. It's not the same thing as saying that Jews should not exist, and that's why I think in the socialist tradition we've always been saying that we believe in a one-state solution, i.e. that all the peoples that live in that area, Jews, Christian, Druze, Muslims, should be together in one state. That is the sort of that's not going to necessarily mean socialism, but the forces to destroy Israel, as I tried to say before, can bring a movement which can radicalize everybody in the area in a very, very more profound way. So I think it's important to say, yes, we think that Israel should be dissolved in its present state.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. And then it's Jeremy. Yeah.
Well, it's just a very short question. Do you know how life were for Jews before Zionism? I mean, in Palestine, because I read a book about. I don't remember the name of the author. Maybe it was Michael Bauman or something. He wrote a book called "The Short History Behind of the Israel-Palestine Conflict." And I remember it said in the start something about that before Zionism, that there was that Jews and Muslims and Christians could live relatively in harmony at that time. But then I heard some other people saying that that's a myth. That there's always been sort of anti-Semitism in the Middle East and around Palestine before Zionism came to be and so on. And I just wanted to hear your opinion because I'm just a little confused about whether or not how anti-Semitism has been in that particular area before Zionism compared to, of course, how it is today. I mean, after the Zionism and Israel-Palestine conflict and the anti-Semitism in Europe in modern times and so on. I mean, I thought maybe you could tell me if you know how life was for Jews in the Middle East before Zionism and in regards to anti-Semitism and so on.
I was curious who is really, if you can name drop any of the contemporary radical Jews besides the few I'm aware of course, Noam Chomsky, Norman Finkelstein, they're sort of think also beyond the Israeli Zionist situation. Obviously now there's a lot of Jewish voices that have come forth as anti-Zionist or non-Zionist Jews, and obviously specifically speaking about that. But I mean, is there anybody else who's sort of putting in the broader context of the exploitation of the whole world, basically, the more sort of bigger anti-capitalist picture, and with any voices to be aware of?
Ole?
Yes. Noam Chomsky is a radical, is also a Jew. I think it would be both non-pertinent and impertinent to call him a radical Jew. Same for Norman Finkelstein. You could be a radical today and be a Jew, but the two things are not necessarily connected. There's this sort of
Well, they're culturally Jews. They're not like believing Jews as far as.
Right. Would you call a member of the Danish church who happened to be radical socialist, would you call him a Christian socialist?
No, but
No, all right.
they themselves are outspoken that they come from a Jewish background and they have that context.
Yes, but does that necessarily tie up with the radicalism? I think we should coming back to the question of Jewish exceptionalism, going back to Karl Marx, his father Heinrich had his family baptized, if I'm not wrong, in 1818, was it? And Marx was not a Jew, he was seen as a Jew, he did not identify as a Jew. He was seen as a Jew by people who were against him, more or less. I think we should recognize the fact that people can be Jews and radicals, and Jews are not radicals, and people can cease being Jews. Famous example in is a great Danish predicator Brandes, who ceased to be a Jew, and you should have a right to do that. And which brings me to my objection to the whole concept of Jewish radicalism today. No doubt there has been a tradition of Jewish radicalism. I don't see any point in thinking of it as something that should be revived today necessarily. You can be a Jew and radical, you can be a Jew not radical, you can be radical and not a Jew. What has Jewry got to do with it? Nothing.
Okay. And then it's Carla.
Yeah. I just wanted to, well, actually, tie a little bit of this. You talked about the unite the right and Israeli flags and the demos and the whole who do the Jews in these different currents and sort of unite with? Because I think that is very relevant. I think it's very good to hear sort of also your statistical sort of went through of which groups of radicals and different currents were present historically, and I think we see that today as well, right? Like we see how the Zionists and the Israeli state is very much linked up on the right wing today, and I don't think that's not a coincidence, and I don't think that it's also not a new phenomenon at all. I was did a talk on whole Israel history a while ago. That was the first time I heard about the sort of the background of the Balfour Declaration, which was the British national state saying that they supported a Jewish national state being founded. This was 1917. But what was an interesting background for that was that Arthur Balfour, who was I believe the foreign minister of Britain at the time, was very much anti-Semitic. He was very interested in forming a national state somewhere in the world for Jews so that he could send the Jews away from Britain. And that's sort of like the unity of Zionists and anti-Semites throughout history has also been a very sort of important factor in the creation of the Israeli state. And I feel like that is sort of an important part of the history of Israel, and a sort of I think very interesting in lights of or in contrast to what you're describing with the radical Jewish tradition, which is the other part of this, which is the Jewish people who have, because of, as you put it very well, the exploitation, the oppression, have united very much with the left wing, with the radicals, with revolutionaries, with socialists, and of course it's not Jewish essentialism, because it's very exceptionalism. Sorry, because it's very clear that, of course, Jewish people, as with any other people, it depends on who they unite with, and that's where we should be looking. We should not be looking at whether they're Jews or not. But at the same time, I'm not sure I agree with you that it's not interesting whether these people are radicals and Jews and what connection that has, because being in that position, not not so much as whether you yourself identify as a Jew, but being identified as Jewish from the outer world, that creates that radicalism. And that's not very much a matter of self-identification. I agree, if you don't want to identify as Jewish, you shouldn't be, but at the same time, the world might do that to you, and that creates something, that creates a radical position, potentially at least. And I think it is very important to link those things. I don't think that they should be separated. Yeah, I think that was my input.
I keep forgetting your name.
That's all right. Penny.
Penny. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back in two covers. Firstly, I think we all are also optimistic because we believe in the power of the working class to organise and overthrow capitalism. That we think, well, there are people in Israel. There must be some people who are really kicking off about what's going on. And actually, what is really shocking is they had a strike. It was a reactionary strike, you know, so I can't remember whether they wanted more deaths in Gaza or they're actually sending trips, you know, to watch the bombing of Gaza. They're going almost up to the border. I mean, it's almost staggering, but that is what settler colonial, society creates, and that's what I so much agree with what you said, because absolutely there are Jewish people, as Don said, there are Jews who are not radical, there are Jews that are bosses, multinational corporations, and can be identified or not, but it's society. We're not in bubbles, we're not in isolation. So when Don's dad was 15, he refused to stand up and sing the equivalent of the Horst Wessel song with your gun, and refused to, and they broke his fingers. So he could never type, or he wasn't a musician anyway. But so he'd always had these broken fingers. It was the British occupying Palestine who put him in prison. It was a 2-year thing. He got out after 1 year, and he used to look around our kitchen table. He said the cell that 37 were in were about the size of this. And they couldn't all lie down, they used to have to all take it in turns and stuff. It was horrific conditions. They escaped, they're leafleting, Don's mum and dad are leafleting the university in illegal circumstances, which is why we have, in our tradition, the IS and SWP tradition, have got quite a lot of respect in countries that have been operating under illegal circumstances, because that's how we arose, as a political tradition. And what they could do is just throw the leaflets of the top floor of the library, and they would flutter down, and they would run like hell, try not to be arrested. Eventually, in these starvations, they managed to escape to Britain. And what does the British government do? They expel him. He'd have been in Rwanda or wherever now, but Cliff was sent to Ireland for 5 years. Luckily, he came back and managed to conceive Don in that visit. But he had a letter from the British government, who were very posh, and said, so you've got 5 days to get out of the country. I remain your obedient servant. So it's like I said, well, if you're my obedient servant, I'm not going. So all of these forces create what you feel. And Don has not got a religious bone in his body. Our family, we've got 2 children. I had death threats for years before I met Don from Nazis. Those are the years. How personal can they get? They really trying to find where you live, etc. We were getting death threats, and our 12-year-old daughter picked up the phone, and it was obviously a child, a light voice, and yet the Nazis, threatened her. And I said, "Who's that on the phone?" And she came back stiff-legged and said, "Oh, it was a death threat," like as if that was normal, but. She said her heart was racing, later on. She went round Auschwitz when she was 14, and then with the Anti-Nazi League, and then did a speaking tour. And our son, we've never brought them up religious. It's the Nazis that label us as Jewish, and that's how it's actually formed our identity. And that's the radicalising section. We don't grow up in isolation. We grow up as the way people see us. And relate to us, and so I think that is a powerful way of forming, your idea and your understanding of the world. So I think, I absolutely agree with what you said too.
Right. we still have a bit of time. I have put myself on again for a shorter amount this time, I promise. I just wanted to... No, I'm the chair. I also agree with Carla. I get what you're saying, Ole, and I think if you get to be a Noam Chomsky, then you can probably decide whatever you want, right? You have so much, what should we call it, cultural capital that you don't, not that you don't have to worry about how people position you at all, but it's still less important than it is for less known people, maybe. I want to name drop someone who is not famous, but who was here for our Marxisme festival in November. Rachel Shapiro, who is an American Jew who has lived in Berlin for the last 5-7 years and considers herself American, I guess, but also German and also Jewish. She has family members who died in camps, and she is being told on an almost daily, or maybe weekly, maybe daily basis by older German people, when she is forms part of the Palestine movement in Germany, which is being clamped down on really hard by police. She's being told often by older German people that she's an anti-Semitic ward on society and whatever. She has that family history, the one that they take hostage and use as a shield for all kinds of stuff that you're apparently allowed to do to Arabs. And they weaponize Jewish identity that way. So I think she is someone who is, I would call, a radical Jew at this point, and whether she wants it or not, she's being positioned as such when she's made to think about the position she's in, being called an anti-Semite, having that family history and having gone through that reckoning of having a lot of Zionist people in her own family and still going against that grain, really. So I just wanted to, I don't know, speak on her behalf or whatever. All right. I haven't seen any other hands. We still have a bit of time. You can still man kan også stadigvæk sige noget på dansk, hvis man vil det. You can still make a contribution. If we just kind of silently agree on being done with that, then I'll give the word back to Donny to sum up. But any last comments or questions? No, it doesn't look like it. Okay.
Right. What a lot of questions.
Yeah.
First of all, the question about explaining the revival of the radical Jewish tradition. In a sense, it never died. There's a whole number of people who never abandoned it. It was the establishment of Israel and the massive movement around that, from an imperialist point of view, that kept it down. The revival of the radical Jewish tradition is the revival of the tradition of all of us. It's about the world of capitalism is in crisis, and whether you're Jewish or not, or whether you identify as being Jewish, whatever, the class struggle will out, if you like. Dissolving the state of Israel. Bookchin, has it ever gone away? Let's see. The state of Israel has to be dissolved. The state of Israel does not represent Jews, never did. It represents a Zionist project which fits with world imperialism, and it doesn't benefit me, it doesn't benefit Jews around the world, it doesn't benefit anybody. So absolutely, dissolve the state of Israel. It's an imperialist invention to oppress everybody, including Jews, and anti-Semitism exists. Big move of Jews to Israel. Any solidarity? Is it a pipe dream? The answer is yes. In a sense, the Israeli population is committed because it's a settler state, which is kept going by world imperialism. You will not get a movement from within Israel to destroy it. It'll be when all the supports from around it are ripped away and there is no alternative that the Jewish radical tradition, in a sense, will be able to revive. Because it's taken a blow with the establishment of the State of Israel. Seriously, that has done the damage. Let's see, where do we go next? Yeah, can you compare the potential for a radical tradition with the Jewish and the Irish radical tradition? I think the answer is yes. If you have exploitation and oppression combined, then you can have very, very radical developments. And that was true in Ireland, and that was true for Israel, for Jews. But of course, the establishment of Israel and the idea that you're a colonial settled state in the Middle East, and the loyalty that many Jews have for that, is a serious blow in that sense. Let's see. I'm lost here. The Palestine national movement and the problem of class. Yeah, it's important to remember that, of course, it is always a matter of class. Class is always at the core of what we talk about as socialists, as revolutionaries. The Palestine national movement, to bring it back, has to identify with struggle by workers against the bosses, and that includes struggle against the Arab ruling classes as well. So you can't separate them. It's a class question. In the summer, there were riots. How do they manoeuvre on the Jewish question? I don't think they do. I can't think of an answer to that one, to be honest. Israel should not exist. Absolutely, Israel should not exist. We're looking. There's only because it's a racial, racist, imperialist implant in the area. The only solution for socialists is a one-state solution. Now, that one-state solution will not come about by just talking about it. It will be the Arab working classes rising up against their own ruling classes that actually undermine the position of imperialism in the region. It's the Arab ruling classes are part of a system of world imperialism that keeps Israel going and keeps them going. So there is no one-state solution for the Israeli population. There's no one-state solution for anybody who's against anti-Semitism. There needs to be, workers' revolution everywhere. How did the life of Jews in Palestine go? They lived. I mean, before the establishment of Israel, there wasn't all that much hostility. It was the establishment of Israel deliberately on a racist basis that creates that. It was quite important that the Zionists antagonized and created this division. So it is possible to overcome the division in the area. There doesn't need to be a bloodletting on any side at all. Contemporary radical Jews, Chomsky, Finkelstein, JVP, is there a bigger picture? The answer to this one, I forget what the question is.
More names.
Sorry?
More names.
Anybody else who's sort of part of that?
Oh, in terms of the radical Jewish tradition?
Today, like who's...
Well, I include myself now.
Definitely.
No, I don't compare myself with all those very important people. No, I mean...
People have spoken out, and
yeah, I mean,
in touch with all of them in the UK, and there's movements, to be on the anti-racism demonstrations against Tommy Robinson and the fascists, and they are carrying the Star of David. They are carrying the Zionist flags, and they hate the Palestinian flags, and that we faced them down. We had 5,000, sorry to interrupt, but 5,000, we had 5,000, they had 500 in Glasgow. And you heard the fascists saying they're all Catholics, so that's why there's so many of them. They just They dream so many, they have so many children. They couldn't explain that we were so big. You know, we had to
Okay,
find
let's
them.
go back to. Yeah.
No, I was enjoying that. Yeah. So the question about Jewish exceptionalism, is there a who is Jewish, etc., etc., etc. I mean, it's socially defined. It's nothing to do with genetics. It's nothing to do with. It is a socially defined question, and there is the idea of Jewish exceptionalism. In a sense, in Western culture, there is. Anti-Semitism played a very, very specific role, but there's nothing exceptional about Jews at all. It's about the political angle that is used to divide and rule the population. It's a political question, nothing to do with Jews themselves in a sense. It's quite arbitrary that it happened to be them. Who do Jews unite with now? Jews and the right aligning today. I think you'll find a division, just like a division in all countries between ruling class supporters and working class supporters. And so there are lots of radical Jews, there are lots of reactionary Jews, the same as the population everywhere. So there's not really an answer to that one. And I think, have I missed anything out?
Oh, it's fine.
I think you're fine, unless
That's
you have
fine.
some closing remarks yourself.
That's
Then,
No.
yes, thank you.